All right, I think we're ready to go now. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the first policy committee meeting of the year. First item up is approval of the minutes from October. Minutes were sent out. I didn't see anything that needed to be changed, but Todd, Tina, or Sue, did you all see anything that needed to be changed? All right, so we're going to consider those minutes approved. Thank you. And we'll have a first period of public comment. We normally get a presentation on the consideration of whatever policies or regs on the docket. Then we have some board comment, committee comment, and board comment. We normally provide opportunity for public comment throughout. But we also have an initial opportunity for public comment. We just ask that you state your name for the record. Good evening.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Maggie Gaines. I'm here with my husband Mark and our 6-year-old daughter Martha, who is color. We live in Wayne. I am here tonight speaking to make the school board aware of how its threat assessment policy is being implemented in the elementary schools of TE to the detriment of students. My daughter Margot is a kindergartner at Valley Forge Elementary School, and she now has a record with the Tredyffrin-Police for making a threat to her teacher. What type of threat could this adorable little girl have made? On November 19th, Margot, who has Down syndrome and often struggles transitioning between activities, was asked by her teacher to do something she did not want to do. At one point in her refusal, she pointed her finger at her teacher and said, "I shoot you." I imagine the utterance was not unlike the instances when I told her it's time for bed, and she says, "I hate bed. I hate Mommy." As most parents can attest, I have learned not to take offense, for I know that a short time later she is usually cuddled up to me while we read bedtime stories and exchange kisses and cuddles before saying goodnight. At any rate, the teacher interpreted this response as a threat and brought Margot to the principal, who talked to my daughter and quickly determined that she neither understood what she was saying nor meant any harm to her teacher or any of her classmates. The principal then followed district policy and convened a threat assessment team. The threat assessment team met and determined Margot had made a, quote, transient threat, which is simply an expression of anger or frustration with no intent to harm anyone. The threat assessment team recommended no disciplinary action. Also, there was no recommendation from the principal, Margot's teachers, nor any other members of Margot's IEP team to address the problem behavior in her IEP, since it appeared to be an isolated event. I think most people would agree that this is where the issue should have ended, and yet it did not. Hours after the threat assessment team met, the principal informed me by phone that the school was still required under the district's policy to call the police regarding the incident. I disagreed and argued it was absurd to involve the police for an episode involving a kindergartner who pointed her finger, not in malice, but in protest to a request to change classrooms. The principal agreed to discuss the issue further with me the next day. After reviewing policy 5401, my husband and I did not see anywhere in the text that required the school to call the police for a transient threat. That evening, I sent an email recapping my concerns regarding the policy to Becky Wills, the principal, Ellen Turk, the district safety officer, Chris Grappi, director of individualized student services, and Mark Cataldi, director of assessment and accountability for the district. More than 24 hours later, after the incident had occurred, I received another phone call from Becky Wills and Ellen Turk, who told me they had conferred with the district's administration and concluded the policy required them to, quote, consult law enforcement, unquote. Ellen Turk admitted during our discussion that the purpose of the so-called consultation with police was not applicable in Margot's case. But she said that because this was the district's policy, she had to follow it without exception for every student in every situation. There was no room for anyone in the district to use common sense to interpret the policy any differently. My husband Mark and I insisted on being on the phone when the call was made to the Tredyffrin Police Department. The information that was relayed was the same as what would be given to law enforcement when filing a police report. They recorded my daughter's name, birth date, and address. They asked for the names and birth dates of myself and my husband, and they took details of what happened. When I asked Officer Garnes, who took the call, if he viewed this as a consultation, he answered no. He said he was merely recording what had happened. I also asked how long the information would be held by the Tredyffrin Police Department. He said it was entered into the department's database and would not be deleted or expunged after any reasonable time period. I asked who could access this information, and he said it was publicly available. I am well aware that we live in a time when parents are concerned for their children's safety in school. When I think of incidents at Parkland High School or Sandy Hook Elementary School, I too am haunted and disgusted. But I also think our society and our schools across the country have overreacted with respect to perceived threats. For instance, resulting in even a finger gun wielded kindergartner being viewed as cause to alert authorities. In fact, Dr. Dewey Cornell, professor of education at the University of Virginia, who developed the threat assessment program that TE district policy is modeled after, said as much in a webinar last month discussing best practices for threat assessment. Not only does he point out that statistically schools are far safer than other public places, such as restaurants, where people are 10 times more likely to be victims of homicide, he also warns of the damaging and costly mistake schools make in overreacting to perceived threats. Even though TE has adopted a threat assessment model that is supposed to minimize such overreactions as the one involving my kindergartner, the reality is that the way the policy is implemented is no different than the zero tolerance policies that experts say are ineffective and inappropriate, especially for elementary school students. In other words, regardless of the severity of the threat, and regardless of the disciplinary action taken or not taken, TE escalates its response to police for each and every incident, regardless of how minor it may be, and regardless of how young the student may be. The result is that a police record is generated and archived in each and every instance. I find this application of the threat assessment policy to be out of line with its intended purpose, which is to identify and help troubled students who may harm others in the future, and to prevent that from happening. I do not believe the school board intended for our schools to create police records for kindergartners. Engaging in developmentally appropriate, nonviolent behavior because they feel educators and administrators in our schools are not equipped to determine if a 6-year-old pointing a finger at them is really a threat. As far as I am aware, no one in the history of mankind has ever been killed or hurt in this way. Escalating such incidents is not only a waste of school resources, but it also documents for local law enforcement even the most minor infractions of childhood. I cannot emphasize enough how inappropriate this practice is for the children of this district. My daughter is but one example of how this policy has gone awry. Because the school staff and administration chose to blindly follow this policy, An incident that resulted in no disciplinary action, nor any change to her IEP, is part of her permanent school record. What's more, her personal information has also been recorded at our local police department, where it is noted, without any context to the situation or her disability, that she threatened her teacher. How or if this information will be used against her in the future, I can't say for certain. What I do know is that students like my daughter Margot, who have intellectual disabilities, are disproportionately disciplined in school. Data collected from the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights found in a report published in 2018 that students with disabilities accounted for 28% of referrals to law enforcement for school-related arrests, 26% of out-of-school suspensions, and 24% of expulsions. Additionally, students with disabilities account for the vast majority of students restrained or secluded in schools. In fact, the report found that children served by the federal special education law, IDEA, represented 71% of those restrained and 66% of students subjected to seclusion. All of this is to say that a district policy that criminalizes age-appropriate, nonviolent behavior of elementary students is troubling for my husband and me. And the fact that students with disabilities are statistically more likely to be victimized by these policies concerns us greatly. We will not allow our daughter to be part of these statistics. What is also troubling to us is how the TE staff and administration chose to interpret the policy in the strictest possible way, without any consideration for the fact that Margot is a kindergarten student and that she has a disability. The district staff and administration, including Becky Wills, Chris Grappi, Ellen Turk, and Mark Cataldi, had more than 24 hours to consider and discuss our concerns, and yet they chose to involve the police for a kindergartner making a threat with a finger. My husband and I are here tonight to ask the committee to clarify Policy 5401, which deals with threat assessment, to ensure there is an appropriate response to perceived threats so that school officials are not over-reporting minor disciplinary issues to law enforcement. We also ask that the board explicitly spell out in a decision tree, as is recommended by the University of Virginia's framework, how administrators and staff are expected to respond and assess threatening comments and situations. And we ask that the policy require school officials to consider the age and developmental appropriateness of any action they take or report, as well as a student's disability, rather than blindly following a policy that I believe even they know goes too far. Thank you.
Mrs. Haynes, thank you for articulating your concerns. They are both valid and heard, so I want you to know that. Mr. Dolby, can you give some context or?
Yeah, I could certainly do that. I hear your concerns, and certainly there was time that there was a discussion about it. I certainly don't want to talk about any particular student situation, but I do want to acknowledge that, and I'd be happy to provide additional information and background. So it is written in the policy as part of the threat assessment team that we have implemented threat assessment teams at each of our schools and consult with law enforcement. It's written in that way. It says consult with law enforcement. And the background on that is when we were going through that policy and regulation revision after we had done parent groups, we did research, we contacted experts, we got legal opinion, we looked at other school districts' information about the policies and regulations they had in place. And you're correct, Dr. Dewey Cornell out of UVA was certainly a model. When you talk to other experts and you do a legal review of other districts, we found didn't have a lot, but some did across the nation. kept hearing that name over and over again. So certainly, we did pull in a lot of things that were based out of the University of Virginia. And in fact, in the UVA model, Dr. Dewey Cornell, in the setup of threat assessment team, mentions having a law enforcement on the actual team. So the reason why the draft, which was then finally approved, was written as consulted law enforcement, is because when we were writing that, we didn't, at least from my perspective in writing it, as a board, I thought it was very difficult to require a separate entity to have their personnel on a threat assessment. So in other words, I found it difficult to write. The school board policy in 5401 requires that a law enforcement official be on the threat assessment. So rather than write it that way, we said consultant law enforcement because it followed the model from UVA at its heart. And that was meant to be going through that process. If there's any determination that there was a threat, whether it be transient or substantive, it was contact law enforcement because they need to be informed and you work with them. Furthermore, written into school code and related to the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency, it says that each threat assessment team should include other school staff or community resources who serve as regular team members or be consulted during the threat assessment process as appropriate and as determined necessary by the team, including law enforcement agency representation. So we feel that also aligns with the policy that you have, we're talking about right now, that talks about consulting with law enforcement. There's also a reference that came out a couple summers ago from the U.S. Secret Service and the United States Department of Education, also mentions a reference to having law enforcement involved in the threat assessment process. So certainly the process was meant to be uniform. It can be challenging, and we certainly can hear individual cases and look at background, but the process is meant to be uniform so that we're trying to seek out others that could have information that we may not know about that could help inform us as we move forward with any particular plan. Certainly we want to take the developmental age of any student, any needs that the students have, but at the same time, from my point of view, we look at it as more as partnering with law enforcement, and if law enforcement had any additional information that could help us or have them respond in a certain way, then we feel like they need to be included.
Could you speak briefly to what governs our relationship with law enforcement? So that's memorandum of understanding, is that annual agreements?
We do have a current memorandum of understanding with the local police departments. That's mandated by law that we have those. And the ones that we have in place have to be renewed every 2 years. We just recently redid those. And those MOUs, there are state templates that you can use as a district. So one of the things when we had to renew, we worked with our legal representation to review that. And if there are any changes that a district would like to make to the state template, you have to inform the state and let them know and have some kind of approval process. After reviewing it, us reading it, legal reading it, we thought, there's everything in there. We don't need to change anything. We'll go with the state template and therefore work with our police department to sign it. So those are in place. It's state template. There were no changes that we did on our behalf in there, and there's no true reference to this type of. There's not a true reference to all threats that are in that MOU. This situation with threat assessment is guided by our policy 5401, which is what I just spoke about, the procedures that are outlined.
public comment. Is there any other questions to this?
Yeah, so in 5401, is there a definition of what a consultation is? Because to me that is just, letting the police know what happened versus an actual report being filed. So I would think the consultation would happen first before a report is filed, especially in the case that we just heard. You would think like they were told what had happened and said, we agree with the threat assessment team and the principal and the teachers that it was a transient threat. So is that clearly defined what a consultation is?
Consult does not have a separate definition in that policy. Certainly, the committee would like to see that, so we could work on that. I also think we're more than happy to talk with our police departments, but if they have procedures they need to follow, I guess they're going to follow their procedures. And we could certainly, from our point of view, say it's truly meant as a consult. That's all it's meant. And we've emphasized that with our administrators. We're not calling to say we want to file a police report. We're calling because we're going through a threat assessment process and we want to consult with you. And what the police do, we can talk with them, but I don't know, they might have internal procedures that they have to follow, and they have to say, well, I can write consult down, but I still have to take information. I'm not sure. They'll have procedures I'm sure they need.
So there's nothing in the memorandum in the way with the police department that talks about, it provides for some sort of informal consultation or something along those lines that allows some flexibility in that regard.
There is, to my recollection, in the MOU, there is a reference to terroristic threats, which by definition I'm going on would be a different level of threats than an individual threat. And once again, using our model, transient versus substantive. But the MOU does mention terroristic threats from the state template, saying that's you have options to report that or not. You have options in the MOU to report terroristic threats. I believe the state template is behind in that, and I think we might be seeing changes. Because once again, there's other references at the state level that talk about having law enforcement involved. I can't say that for sure. I don't know what they're going to do, but I wouldn't be surprised if we do see that happening. It no longer is optional to report a terrorist threat.
But other than that, there's nothing that governs the police department's processes when it comes to this type of consultation that at least is now integrated into our policy when it comes to crisis.
There's language in there about students with disabilities and giving consideration for that, but not necessarily
With the police, with the MOU?
in the MOU. We also have language in our policy and regulation, which related to that as well. But not necessarily defining what consultation is or how they handle things or.
At the end of the day, there's very little that the school district can do to cover what the police are doing.
I understand that, and so that's what well, at least currently, there's very little that we can do at that point. This is if the policy is at the heart of the policy in terms of threat assessment and consulting law enforcement is consulting with an idea towards cooperation and working with them on a partner-like basis in a reasonable way. And but we have to have two sides to be able to do that. And if we know, and if we can't come to some sort of arrangement with our local police department that is, allows for these sorts of scenarios to be less formal and official, like it sounds like this one was, then it strikes me that that's that puts us in a difficult spot. And if we truly want to partner with our local law enforcement, then there has to be some sort of flexibility and understanding on their part as well. And so if we're going to be in a situation where the police department or our local law enforcement is not going to be in a position to be able to tell us, well, look, you can't come to us and informally consult, and we're not going to write up this report, then that's going to require, at least in my view, that necessitates us to re-review our policy to allow more discretion on the part of our own folks to be able to decide when they're going to consult or not with local law enforcement. So I'm exploring those things because I appreciate that you want to be able to provide this, apply this policy in a uniform way. We went through a long period of focus groups and research, and it's difficult to make exceptions on a case by case basis, and that was sort of one of the things that came out of this is that, look, this has to be applied in a uniform way. But if applying it in a uniform way results in engenders these sorts of results, I think we do, and because we can't find a partner in law enforcement that will allow us to consult on a more cooperative and informal basis, then I think it's incumbent upon us to re-examine the policy and the practices under the policy so that we don't run into these issues. Because frankly, I understand that there's context around this, but on its face, this sounds, it sounds a bit like over.
Sue, did you have any questions?
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
She said.
I said, actually, Mr. Cantor said covered my question.
So, is there anything new that anybody wanted to?
I just had a question about what happens to that information that's given to the police, and if there's a record, is that publicly available? And since I know there are issues that you can give information to somebody like the police that's in the best interest of the district, but is it protected because they're minors, or is it publicly available?
I don't necessarily know what the police officer meant when he said that's public information from their own police records. I would tell you, though, we are required to report a certain level of student matters to the state in an anonymous, confidential way that talks about there are certain things, and certainly threats would be one of them. It relates to state reportable, they call it disciplinary, but I'm avoiding that because I don't want to suggest that every time we have one of these, there's actually a disciplinary consequence, because those things are separate. We take a look at the whole thing and determine what, if any, consequences of discipline should be used, what education, what supports, etc. But we're required to report those. At the end of the school year, they get sent to the state, and that isn't publicly accessible. But once again, it's anonymous. There's no student names associated with it, but we do have to report that. We're required to do a certain level of disciplinary matters to report those. So I don't know if that's what he meant by it, or if they have a request that they have to release it somehow. I don't really know how that relates to a police report that they took. Once again, we're looking at it as a concept.
All right. Question?
So is there a possibility of us bringing that policy line forward again to take a look at this decision tree? I think that the request I heard was to look at the decision tree, was assessed as a transient threat, and maybe we need to evaluate, have a discussion around when it's a transient threat. So it's applied equally here, that it has to be uniformly applied. So when it's a transient threat, maybe in that decision tree, as long as it doesn't violate any MOU or what the state template is for the police, that we are able to do it by grade level as well as considering whether the child has an IEP, developmental, age appropriate, those types of things. I know, look, I went through that whole focus group thing last year as an observer, and I understand what the feedback was that we got, and I think there may need to be possible re-examination. I know you're before we did it tonight, so it'll take some time to.
So to Todd's point, and off of that, it seems like there needs to be some alignment of the policy with police practice. I think that's where the disconnect seems to be. Because what we're hearing is there's no guarantee, if we follow whatever policy we have, that the police aren't going to somehow overreach. So,
Excuse me.
I guess
because we're gonna let them respond first, and then we'll go back to the public.
I guess I just want to say, in our estimation, I do have to say, I don't think I've heard of a case where we have felt the police have done something that we wouldn't have agreed with. So I guess we're looking at it as a console, I guess, and that's where I'm saying, I don't know what their internal procedures are. We're not trying to generate some, we're not filing a police report. But at the same time, I certainly don't want anybody to walk away, at least from our point of view, thinking any of our police departments we feel has done anything different. Like they, I guess, depending upon what officer maybe was taking the information. And I want to give an example of why that might be important. Because you get one officer who might take information, and once again, the consult is meant to be, are there other things that might be of concern in a uniform way, right? So if they need the information so they can go back and probably check and see, is there any history to this? So I'll make up a history not related to anything here or anything that I know about. But I'll just completely make one up. And if we were to share information, even if it's a transient threat, and we tell the police, and they have knowledge